Offensive photos emerge of the Prime Minister in brown and blackface. We have breaking news with a third photograph.
Maternal love is the love that's going to change the future of mankind. So we'd like you to look
we like to say people kind, not necessarily mankind, because it's more inclusive.
There we go, exactly. Yes, thank you.
We can all learn from each other.
We have recently switched to drinking water bottles out of when we have water bottles out of plastic. Away from plastic towards paper, like drink box water bottles, sort of thing.
Just some of the many gaffes of Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Joining us now to discuss Canadian politics and his re-election chances, we're joined by analyst, author and campaigner Jonathon Van Maren. Jonathon, thanks very much for being here this morning. And can you tell us first of all, why is it Justin Trudeau seems to put his foot in it so often?
Well, he was sort of born with a silver foot in his mouth. For those people who aren't really aware of his pedigree, his father was the Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, and Justin Trudeau had a pretty unimpressive career prior to being elected an MP, basically on the strength of his name. He was a part-time drama teacher, a snowboard instructor. He started several degrees without finishing them and just sort of wandered around and lived a very high-flying lifestyle, which he could do because, of course, he had a fairly significant inheritance that was left to him. And then when he joined politics, of course, the Liberal Party was in huge disarray. And one commentator put it really well. He said Justin Trudeau was sort of break glass if needed. And when the Liberal Party was really in shambles, had been consistently beaten by the Conservative Party a few times in a row, they thought, you know what, let's break out Justin and see if that works. And Justin Trudeau basically won the 2015 election on his woke image, his progressive image, his nice hair, things like that.
So just how damaging is this brown face scandal to his re-election chances?
Well, you know, it's pretty hard to tell for a couple of reasons. One, Canadians are pretty used to Justin Trudeau saying stupid stuff like this and doing stupid stuff like this. So on one hand, I don't think a lot of people were shocked. And when you had people coming out and saying, we're shocked and outraged, I'm not sure that was the right strategy because most people aren't shocked and outraged, right? You guys saw the video footage of him scampering across India wearing so many costumes that the Bollywood designers were making fun of him, right? Like nobody's surprised that that guy wore blackface. At the same time, where it is more of a potent message is if anybody else had worn blackface once, much less 3 times, everybody knows that Justin Trudeau and his crew would be calling for their resignation, calling them a Nazi, saying that this was indicative of some deep-seated racist sentiment that people just weren't letting the voters in on. So I think that where this does hurt him is it does indicate that he's a real hypocrite and that he's sort of this privileged guy who's demanding that everybody else live up to standards that he consistently hasn't lived up to himself. So I don't think the actual blackface itself is going to make that big of an impact simply because nobody's really surprised that Justin got busted doing this. But it is just another sign to voters who are getting pretty fed up with this sort of thing that Justin's a hypocrite. And second of all, Canadians are really snobby about how humble they apparently are. You know, everybody says that, you know, Canadians are really polite and Canadians are sort of perversely proud of their reputation for being polite. So a lot of them don't care that Justin Trudeau wore blackface, but they don't like being laughed at on the front page of the New York Times and the BBC and the CNN. So Justin Trudeau can get away with wearing blackface, but whether or not the Canadians will let him get away with embarrassing them on the international stage, that's a different question entirely.
So the Conservative Party, I think Trudeau's biggest opponents, have to be delighted with all these gaffes. And is it likely that they will prove to be a significant challenge to his premiership?
Well, so the difficulty is that the head of the Conservative Party of Canada, who's a really nice guy, Andrew Scheer, is very, very bland, and he seems to be sort of running this campaign that highlights the fact that he's bland. It's sort of the mature adult in the room campaign, right? Vote for me and I'll help you balance the books sort of thing, the responsible accountant. But he hasn't gained a whole lot of traction, and the latest polls that just came out last night and again this morning indicate that he hasn't benefited a lot from this so far. But just for those who aren't familiar with Canadian politics, that might not actually mean anything, because for the Conservatives to take power, we need the left to split. And so Justin Trudeau wasn't going to lose a bunch of votes to Andrew Scheer over this blackface scandal. But if he loses a bunch of votes to the New Democratic Party under Jagmeet Singh and the left gets split in a bunch of key constituencies, then Andrew Scheer might really benefit from this. The one other way I think Scheer will benefit from this is they launched their campaign to sort of stereotype Trudeau in the minds of voters, just a couple of weeks ago. And their ad said not as advertised. Basically, that Trudeau said he was going to be for women, yet he fired 2 female cabinet ministers in the midst of a huge scandal. He said he was going to balance the budget. He's billions in the red right now. He said that he was really woke. Now look at this blackface thing. And so the not as advertised advertising, I think, actually has a pretty good chance of gaining some traction with the voters.
And that scandal you mentioned, I think, in which he tried to have an investigation called off into quite a corrupt company, apparently, has that really been the major stumbling block in his approach to the next election?
Well, yeah. So the funny thing about the scandal is that Justin Trudeau is not just the first prime minister to be convicted of a federal crime in office once. He now has the distinction of being the only prime minister in Canadian history to get convicted of breaking federal law twice. So it's really unprecedented. But where the historical trends are working against Conservatives is that if Andrew Scheer would defeat Justin Trudeau in the election on October 21st, he would be, I believe, the 3rd prime minister since 1867, since we became a country, to actually unseat a prime minister with a majority government. The first was John A. Macdonald, the first prime minister, who ran against Alexander Mackenzie and won, then Wilfrid Laurier, and then it would be Andrew Scheer. And for your viewers, who don't know a whole lot about the men that I just mentioned, they were really impressive statesmen in a way that we haven't quite seen from Andrew Scheer at the moment. But yeah, again, the breaking federal law twice, it's really basically put Justin Trudeau and his Liberals in a position where they're really running out of ammunition. Right? They were going to run this whole campaign trying to paint the Conservatives as racist. And now, unless they find somebody in the Conservative Party who's worn blackface 4 times, he can't really use any of that Oppo research anymore. He ran the last election accusing then Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper of being corrupt. But now he's the first prime minister in Canadian history to get convicted of a federal crime twice. So he can't use that. And so he's just kind of stuck. All of his best pitches to the Canadian people that he's used to using are no longer available to him.
And Jonathan, to outsiders, it sometimes seems as if a lot of Canadians are hyper concerned about politically correct issues and progressive agendas. Is that the case on the ground, or is it that there's a centre there that tend to throw their lot in behind Trudeau for other reasons?
Yeah, so I think that Canada is very similar to other countries. So we have, unfortunately, the vast majority of people in Canada live in a handful of city centres. So in the greater Toronto area, for example, here in Ontario, you've got almost 9 million people in a country of 33 million people. I lived on the West Coast growing up, and we knew who the prime minister was long before our votes were even counted. Because of the number of time zones Canada covers. So yeah, in downtown Toronto, you have a real concern with political correctness. But the interesting thing is that what the polling data tells us is that the people who are really on board with Trudeau's hyper-progressive agenda, so very pro-choice, very pro-LGBT rights and things like that, most of these people, roughly 60%, are actually white people of European descent, old stock Canadians. The vast majority of people who disagree with Justin Trudeau on those issues, the social conservative issues, are primarily new Canadians. So that would include, Sikhs, it would include Syrian refugees, it would include people from India and Pakistan, it would include Muslims, Orthodox Jews. And so interestingly, when Trudeau talks about these Canadian values all the time, referring to his progressive agenda, the people who are in line with his values are primarily older, post-Christian people of European descent, and the people who are socially conservative are primarily immigrant Canadians who are very against his agenda as it pertains to assisted suicide, abortion, and LGBT issues. So it's really interesting. He talks about Canadian values. He's actually referring to the values of people who look and sound just like him, which is something that most Liberals would be pretty shocked to find out if they read polling data a little bit more careful than they do.
So, Jonathan, you're someone who's campaigned for years on right-to-life issues in particular. You obviously see major changes coming down the tracks to Canada if that trend continues.
Well, so the interesting thing, the struggle that the pro-life movement in Canada has is that quite a few people are actually sympathetic to getting laws restricting abortion, but very few people vote on abortion as the ballot issue. Most of them vote on economic concerns and things like that. And so one of the hurdles that we're working on overcoming is some of your listeners and your viewers might know this, but Canada is the only Western democracy with no abortion laws whatsoever. Abortion is legal right up until the moment of birth here in Canada. If you want a really late-term abortion and there's no doctor in Canada willing to do it, you'll get sent to the United States to get it done there by Dr. Warren Hearn or another late-term abortionist. But 80% of the Canadian public is unaware of the fact that we have no abortion laws. The vast majority of Canadians have no idea that abortion isn't restricted and believe that it is. And so one pro-life group last year actually ran a campaign that just featured billboards along major highways with statements like Canada has no abortion laws. And the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada and their pro-abortion allies in politics actually worked to get those billboards taken down. A billboard that didn't even say, vote pro-life or anything like that. It just pointed out the simple fact that we have no laws. And they wanted those billboards taken down because they know that if huge groups in Canada, especially the immigrant communities, and there's hundreds of thousands of them in Ontario, for example, begin to find out what the status quo in Canada is, that we're going to see the political landscape shift quite a bit because we've got a lot of solid polling data that indicates when Canadians are told what the status quo is, they are appalled and actually want restrictions to be put in place.
Very interesting, Jonathan. Well, so in terms of this election, how do you call it?
I think Justin Trudeau's probably going to get a minority, and I say that for two reasons. I think, one, historical trends just indicate that it's very, very unlikely that a prime minister with a majority government ends up getting kicked out of office. Canadian voters almost always give a prime minister a second kick at the can. And while the blackface thing it's more hilarious than anything else. That somebody, being woker is harder than it looks, right? It's funny because obviously Justin Trudeau can't live up to what he says everybody else should be living up to. And second of all, so far, I don't see the competition really eating into his support significantly. They have a little bit. He's lost a couple of percentage points, and his personal popularity has dropped significantly since 2015. But is that enough to throw enough votes one way or the other? I'm not sure. A Conservative Party wins when the New Democratic Party is strong enough to split the left. And Jagmeet Singh, the head of the NDP, has been really underwhelming. I hope that Canadians start listening to Andrew Scheer's message of, fiscal responsibility, balanced budgets, and things like that. But we'll have to see in the coming weeks. So I hope I'm wrong, but right now I'm calling it for a Trudeau minority, despite the fact that he's pretty crippled as a prime minister. He's pretty unpopular as a prime minister, and he has by far done more stupid and illegal things than any prime minister in recent history.
But there is endless entertainment with him.
Well, yeah, that's true. So we Canadians are glad to be handing the rest of the world our clown jackass prince for everybody to laugh at. You want to know something funny? Justin Trudeau likes to consider himself to be sort of the world's woke boyfriend, and his popularity is actually less than Donald Trump's.
There you go. Well, Jonathon Van Maren, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure, Tim. Thanks for having me.